Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Ishee, and this is part 2 of our history of the Ischi family of Mississippi. In part 1, we established that our ancestors departed from what we now know as Switzerland, and they departed in the year 1803. Of course, the family legend is that our family was from Germany. Make no mistake about it, our people were Germanic people, and most likely they spoke the German language, but they came from an area that is now known as Switzerland. It was a part of Europe that was in serious conflict with confrontations on a regular basis between Germany and France, Austria. Many countries were involved. They were all basically fighting over this very valuable territory. And the area of our homeland was specifically known at the time of our ancestors' departure in 1803. It was specifically known as the Helvetic Republic. And it was a party of 9 people that set out from Oberpip, Switzerland, with everything they had, everything they owned, in 2 sacks. They traveled to Amsterdam, where they signed a contract for passage aboard the brig Commerce. Let's review quickly. As we mentioned before, this is probably the most important document in our family's history. This is the original passenger list from the ship Commerce, which brought 235 immigrants to America. Just about all of those were described as Germanic immigrants. There were 9 members of our family on board, in order, starting at passenger number 81 and 82. That was Ulrich and his wife Barbara, and then their 5 children, John, Jacob, Maria, Frederick, and Barbara. And then the elder couple, Hans Ulrich and his wife Elizabeth. The grandparents would have been in their 60s, the parents would have been in their 40s, and the 5 children ranged from ages 3 to age 19. Barbara was the youngest at 3, and John was the oldest at 19. And as we mentioned before, their baggage consists of 2 sacks for the entire group. Now let's talk for just a moment about this passenger list, which here what you're looking at is the last page of that passenger list. And I want you to take note of a very curious mathematical notation. Right after passenger number 235, there's a mathematical notation. Now we know that the ship carried 235 passengers when it left Amsterdam. This is the ship Commerce, Captain Nathaniel Ray. But we learned from history in the early 1800s, the late 1700s, it was very common to lose several passengers during the voyage. Those voyages took weeks, sometimes months. And some ships lost 10% of their passengers. Some lost 20% of their passengers. There were some ships that lost half of their passengers due to either sickness or storms. In fact, I've researched, and there was a hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean in the month of September and also October in 1803, and that is exactly where the Commerce would have been, in the western Atlantic off the coast of the eastern United States. That storm was known in history as the Great Norfolk Storm of 1803. But ships also lost passengers due to disease outbreaks. Who knows? Our ancestors arrived on the east coast of the U.S. in October, and evidently it was a very rough voyage. Now, the following is my assumption, but this mathematical notation here, let's talk about this. And this was handwritten on the original passenger list on the last page. We know that there were 235 passengers when they left Amsterdam, but what we don't know is how many they lost, if any, that they arrived at the port of Philadelphia in early October. Now, the following is my assumption, but this mathematical notation suggests that they lost 54 passengers. That would be about 20 to 25%, and they arrived with 181 live passengers. Let's go through the math and imagine a conversation between port officials and Captain Nathaniel Ray on the day that they arrived in Philadelphia. So the captain sits down with the port officials, and The port officials say, well, Captain Ray, we hope you had a good voyage. We know that you were in a storm there in early October, late September. How many did you lose? And they write down the number 54. Somebody writes down that number. And then immediately under that, they write 235. And we have to assume, this is all my assumption, minus 54 equals 181. That's my explanation for this mathematical equation, which is mysteriously found on the last page of the passenger list. Now, the bottom number, this one right down here, that could be interpreted as either times 9, or if you cock your head just a little bit to the side, it reads plus 9. And an explanation for that would be times 9, it would be the amount of fare that was expected to be paid by the passengers, which would be about 9 pounds, I believe. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Or it could be plus 9, which is how many members were in the crew. So, very interesting mathematical problem here that has kept me awake many a night trying to figure out what happened. Now, we mentioned that it was not uncommon for ships to lose passengers during the voyage, and I want to suggest here that it is possible that we lost one of our own ancestors during this transatlantic voyage. I've got no proof of that, but this is a book that was written several years later that had Immigrant and Passenger List. Now, of course, the original handwritten passenger list that we just saw, it has 9 names of the Ischi family. But this list, which was published in a book a few years later, this was a list of people who swore allegiance to the United States in Philadelphia. This list contains only 8 names in our family. And if you'll notice, the name of Barbara is missing from this list. So let's go through them one by one. There's Hans Ulrich and his wife, Senior, Hans Ulrich Ishee and his wife, Junior, and then there was Jacob, Fred, John, and Maria. Where's Barbara? Was her name missing from this list perhaps because she was the youngest child? She was only about 3 years old, we know that. So maybe she didn't have to swear allegiance to the United States. Or could it be that she died somewhere during the voyage? We'll never know. I've never found any documentation that proves either hypothesis, so my research continues. But it is possible that we lost Barbara on the voyage across the Atlantic. Now, this is a ship that is similar to the brig Commerce that is captained by Nathaniel Ray. This is not the exact ship, but this is one that is very similar. Same time frame, roughly 90 feet long, 24 feet wide. It is a brig. She weighed 249 tons, and that was a rather large ship for her time. Now, while we do not have any images of the actual ship Commerce, we do have descriptions that I've found, such as this one. For instance, every time a ship enters or leaves a port, it would be entered into a registry. And this registry entry shows the Commerce was built in Massachusetts in 1795. The owners of the ship were merchants in Philadelphia, Armit Brown and James Brown. And we see that this particular registry entry was in January of 1806, but previously registered in January of 1804 was the Commerce, and that was the voyage just after bringing our family to America. So just a little bit of history about the brig Commerce. Our ancestors would have been in what we know as Steerage Class, which means below decks. It's called steerage because that's where the rudder and other steering gear would have been found at the very back of the vessel. And steerage is generally the middle deck on most ships, and on this particular sample ship, it is the middle deck. The bottom deck of the ship, the very lower part, would be the hold, and that's where water and provisions and things like extra sails would be stored. Most history books describe steerage as the least humane of all passenger accommodations. Conditions would have likely been, well, miserable. Roughly 5 or 6 square feet per passenger, and this is not a weekend trip, people. This is for 6 to 8 weeks of voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The average transatlantic passage in the early 1800s was 51 days. And we believe that the Commerce made the voyage in 39 days, but we're not absolutely certain of that. But imagine being in these conditions during rough seas or even worse in a hurricane. In this image, the passengers are actually trying to cook some food and distribute it amongst themselves. You'll see 2 pots here, and there's children trying to help feed each other. This is just a fascinating image. I could study this for hours and probably find a story in every aspect of this image. Here's another image that has captivated my imagination. The bunks for steerage class were described as family style, and they would hold anywhere from 3 to 6 people in each bunk. I suspect that they would do what we called in the Navy hot bunking. That's where one group of the people, the passengers, would sleep, and then another group would sleep in the same bunk a little while later on, definitely not a comfortable situation. Imagine, again, 235 people in an area roughly 80 to 90 feet long and about 20 feet wide. That was tough. And ships are ships, and all ships have strict rules. Passengers were expected to obey all rules established by the captain. Now, sample rules for passengers in the steerage class, and we're going to quickly read through this. I encourage you to pause the video at any point and read at length if you'd like, but there was a strict regimen of when you could sleep. Cleanliness was undoubtedly a part of the daily routine. They talk about how food is distributed. Bedding had to be aired regularly, but don't hang your clothes out below the decks. No gambling is allowed, and dancing is allowed at certain times. Those are just some examples of rules that you would find in steerage class in the early 1800s. Now, it's extremely rare for descendants of immigrants to learn specific details of their ancestors' immigration and voyage across the Atlantic. But Ischi family, we are very lucky. We have those documents. This document is a word-for-word copy of the contract that the Ischi family would have agreed to in 1803. We are very lucky that the ship Commerce, with Captain Nathaniel Ray as the master, we are very fortunate that this particular ship was well documented. And in order to save time, I'm not going to read the following few pages, but I do encourage you to pause the video and read for yourself. The first page here explains the structure of the fares, how they paid for their journey across the Atlantic. This page of the contract explains how payment was to be made to the captain. This part of the contract explains what they ate during the voyage. Again, I encourage you to pause and read line for line. Now, this page explains the concept of German redemptioners. It explains what a redemptioner is. And then finally, this is an excerpt from a wonderful book that I read called Pennsylvania German Pioneers. And it is my belief that our family were redemptioners. And I do have evidence of that, and we'll be able to explain that in a future episode of this video series. So this is a good point to summarize in this episode of where we are now, episode number 2 of I don't know how many episodes we're going to end up with. It's a fascinating story, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. But here we are at this point, members of the Hans Ulrich Ischi family. immigrated to the United States, and they arrived at the port of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in early October 1803. They were aboard the brig Commerce, which sailed from Amsterdam, and all 9 family members of the Ischies were in Steerage Class with 2 sacks listed as their baggage. There was Hans Ulrich Sr. and his wife Elizabeth. There was Ulrich Jr., his wife Barbara, and then their 3 sons and daughters, John, Jacob, Maria, and Frederick, and also Barbara, whose exact fate is still to be determined. You know, we'll never know all of the details of their voyage across the Atlantic, but what we have learned, I hope you would agree, is fascinating. It's very unusual for families to actually find the contract that their immigrant ancestors would have signed, who the captain was, what they ate for lunch and dinner every day, how much they paid in their fare. We are very blessed to have that type of information. And looking at this picture, I say, you know, every time I see an old sailing ship, I think about our family sailing across the Atlantic Ocean to a brand new world. So welcome to America, Ishee family. Now what? Here's a hint. In the year 1803, which was the same year, call it destiny if you will, but it was the same year as our family's arrival in America, President Thomas Jefferson had just purchased 530 million acres of wilderness in a massive deal that we now know as the Louisiana Purchase. And rumor had it that there was free land up for grabs in some place called Mississippi. So I hope you'll join me for episode number 3, and we'll talk about in that episode the period of 1803 to 1820. That was kind of a black hole in which we have very little documentation of where the Ishee family was and what they were doing. We will talk about the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road and the most likely scenario of how our family, the Ishee family from Switzerland, went from standing on a dock in Philadelphia ultimately to a piece of farmland in the Mississippi Territory. They traveled through Pennsylvania, through Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, and they traveled right into the wilderness of the Mississippi Territory. I hope you'll join me as we make that journey.